Um, Hi, this is Elizabeth Hammond with University of Massachusetts Amherst, and thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, and a particular thank you to Julie Wormser for giving us this webinar that I am really looking forward to. I think this is going to be great. Julie is the Executive Director of the Boston Harbor Association, which is a nonprofit organization that brings together economic development, public access, and sea level rise adaptation along Boston's waterfront. Prior to joining the Harbor Association, she spent 15 years as a senior regional strategist with the Environmental Defense Fund, Appalachian Mountain Club, and the Wilderness Society. She's helped secure millions of dollars in federal funding for forest land and marine fisheries in New England. And most relevant for today, she co-authored the new report, Preparing for the Rising Tide, from the Boston Harbor Association, and Designing with Water, Creative Solutions from Around the Globe. She received her BA in Biology from Swarthmore and her MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And just to take a minute to tell you, our sponsoring group for the webinar is the SAGE Research Coordination Network, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And so this is part of our project to expand the connections between planning, engineering, and public policy around designing and creating resilient coastal communities. And so, Julie, welcome, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be on this webinar. If folks would like to ask questions, it's fine to ask questions throughout the presentation. You use the written chat function, and then our hosts will interrupt me verbally. But I'm happy to be interrupted throughout for clarification or additional questions. So this is a picture of Boston Harbor during Hurricane Sandy. This is Long Wharf, which is one of the first places to flood. And in fact, if you see the front of it, the water's coming over the dock or over the pier. That's not a shallow area. So preparing for the rising tide was Boston Harbor Association's first publication on sea level rise preparedness in Boston. And that came out 4 months after Hurricane Sandy. It had actually been initially proposed as just a pretty simple white paper, but as we were finishing it up, quote unquote, on October 29th, 2012, our building was shaking with Hurricane Sandy, and we realized that it would have a much broader audience, so we took the time to expand it. What this publication does is looks at the neighborhoods that flood first in Boston, and then encourages people, whether they're public or private property owners, in the flood zone. It basically gives a quick summary of how one first identifies their vulnerabilities and then does something about it. A year later, we teamed up with Sasaki Associates, an international architecture and landscape architecture firm, to release Designing with Water. And that looks at what the Dutch have done in terms of flood resilience. If anybody knows flooding, it's the Dutch. And as we all know, they have been extraordinary in building dikes and levees and dams to keep out the North Sea. And yet even they, after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, they realized that building ever higher levees was not the right way to go. So they have looked at alternatives to levees or additions to levees that keep us in contact with water in ways that basically separate flooding from flood damage. So how can we manage water in ways that actually can enhance communities, not damage them? And so both of these publications are available for free on our website. So Superstorm Sandy hit in late 2012. It's the largest coastal storm to ever hit the east coast of the United States in recorded history. A typical hurricane is 300 miles long. This was 1,000 miles long. What made it a superstorm is it actually intersected with a nor'easter, which made it suddenly veer to the west and make landfall at New York and New Jersey. Where it did impact the coast, it wreaked havoc with our transportation system, our cultural icons, electrical grid, and residential areas. But this is what Boston looked like during Hurricane Sandy. This is what it looks like to have a flood of today's high tide plus about 2.5 feet. You could consider this not catastrophic, but nuisance flooding. Now, the thing is, we had this level of flooding 21 times between 1920 and 1990. Between January 2012 and when we stopped counting in April 2014, we had this level of flooding 15 times. And my understanding is we've had this level of flooding since then as well. So this is starting to become a more chronic condition for Boston. So coastal flooding is not just underlying sea level rise. Before I started working in this field, I thought, oh, my poor future grandchildren, what they'll have to deal with at the end of the century. But it's really not about an on-off switch of tomorrow we'll have coastal flooding and today we won't. It's really about increased probability of flooding over time. And there's 3 stars that align to make this happen. The first is storm surges. Now, storm surges, if you listen to or read the weather reports, low barometric pressure is when we have storms. That also means there is less air pushing down on the ocean. So, in fact, when you have low barometric pressure, you actually have higher water levels. They can rebound. They're not pushed down on. The other thing about storm surges is that in this part of the world, we get predominantly nor'easters. Our heavy weather comes from the northeast or the east. And so that wind coming from that direction will push water in front of it as you could push a rug across a slippery floor. And so the water bunches up, and when it hits land, it then causes floods. The tide also has a lot to do with flooding along the coast. So in Boston, we have a 10-foot difference between low tide and high tide. But then a couple times a month when the moon and the sun align, either at full moon or new moon, if you think of vector geometry, they exert gravitational pull in the same direction. And you get a couple more feet for those what we call wicked high tides locally. And then once a year, when the moon is closest to the Earth in its orbit, we get what they call a king tide. So that's an extra wicked high tide. And then the third part of what makes coastal flooding happen is the underlying sea level. And if you think about an energetic child in a bathtub, if you have a very energetic, whether tantruming or just playing child in a bathtub with a little bit of water, your bathroom floor won't flood. If you have a very calm child with a very full bathtub, your bathroom also won't flood. But if you have a very energetic child and a very full bathtub, you'll get quite a bit of coastal flooding in your bathroom. And that's really what's going on here, is that over time, as the underlying sea level rises, the storm or the high tide it takes to flood our coastline gets smaller and smaller. So that's the interaction between surface chop and underlying sea level. So let's look at those in turn.
Julie?
Yeah.
This is Anne from the College of Engineering at Northeastern. Just wanted to point out that you said it is okay to interrupt you. And
absolutely.
So don't forget, I received a comment from Ariana, who is asking if it's possible to share some of these photos that you have in your presentation with her.
Sure. Why doesn't she keep track of what she'd like to see? At the very end, I'll have my email, and she can email me, and anybody else can email. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
You bet. So this is I just took from Google, but this is Boston and New York. It's about 200 miles, 300 kilometers as a bird would fly, but it's not just the distance from the epicenter that caused New York to have a much bigger impact from Hurricane Sandy. It's also our topography. So let's look at Boston. If I can get so this is Cape Cod, this is Cape Ann, and this bumpy part is actually an underwater mountain range called Stellwagen Bank. If you've ever gone whale watching from Boston, that's where the whales hang out because it's much closer to the surface. There's more light, there's nutrients, and there's a lot of sea life there. But those three major topographical features also do a great job of dampening a lot of the storms, particularly coming up from the south. Then you look at Boston Harbor proper. We have Winthrop to the north, Hull to the south, and then we have 34 Boston Harbor islands. If you look at the islands outside the mouth of the harbor, they're quite skinny. They've really taken one for the team in terms of getting battered by storms, as opposed to these wider islands inland that are much more sheltered. And then you look at Boston Harbor, it's quite round. So the combination of those topographical features means that we don't get very strong storm surges. This is a dynamic model. I got this from GZA, an engineering firm. This is a SWAN model, is my belief. So they looked at a rare, a 1 in 100 chance of a wave this high reaching Boston in a year. So they call it a 100-year wave, but really it's a 1% likelihood in a given year wave. If it's 30 feet or 10 meters offshore, it's going to be 2 feet or 2/3 of a meter by the time it hits downtown Boston. So we have this unbelievably protective harbor, and that makes an enormous difference. That's not to say that, here's poor Hull. They don't have the same kind of protection as downtown Boston does. So unlike Boston, New York actually, if you're thinking of the wind coming from the northeast, that water is going to funnel into Long Island Sound. It's going to funnel up from the south up New York Harbor. So all that water concentrates down the East River, up New York Harbor. And in fact, if you look at where that wind can push water, you're going to have probably the most flooding right here and right here at the end of a long fetch of open water. But then as that water goes into New York Harbor, it's a very skinny harbor. There are almost no islands. And there's nowhere for that water to go but up on land. So as a result, Boston is far less vulnerable to storm surges than New York City. If you look at this graph, again, we've been calling them 100-year storms. We need to stop calling them that because that assumes a static external environment. But if you think of this as a 1 in 100 chance of this happening in a given year, a 1 in 1,000 chance of this happening in a given year, basically Boston's 1 in 1,000 chance coastal flood is almost 2 feet lower than New York's 1 in 100 chance coastal flood. And you also see that Boston's flooding really flattens out just above 6 feet, where New York continues rising over time. So as a result, when you think about, if Hurricane Sandy had happened here, well, it wouldn't have happened in the same way. That's good news and bad news, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is what Lower Manhattan saw on Hurricane Sandy. We're going to now look at how storm surges and tides interact. This is the Coast Guard station in the Battery in Lower Manhattan. This is the tide gauge that day, October 29th, 2012. This blue undulating cycle is basically the astronomical predicted tide. This green curve is the observed storm surge, and then the two of those are additive. So this is called the storm tide. And so it's the storm surge plus the underlying tide. And so what you see from this graph is that New York experienced a storm tide 14 feet above low tide during Hurricane Sandy, and or 10 feet above normal high tide. And that is what swamped Lower Manhattan and other parts of New York. This purple bar is essentially the highest astronomical tide, or that king tide that happens a couple times a year. And so Hurricane Sandy did, in fact, occur on a full moon tide, and so you had that extra high tide already. This is, on the other hand, the Coast Guard station in Boston Harbor next to the Northern Avenue Bridge. And this is what we saw in Boston during Hurricane Sandy. Again, the storm surge was much lower, not just because of the distance from the epicenter, but because of the topographical features we saw. One thing I think is neat, but has nothing to do with what we're talking about, is the fact that Boston has a much higher tide cycle than New York. It's because water sloshes between Cape Cod and Nova Scotia. So we have a 10-foot tide instead of New York's 4-foot tide. That's just kind of a neat thing, but has nothing to do with flooding per se. But the thing that does have to do with flooding is Hurricane Sandy's storm surge peaked 5.5 hours after our wicked high tide, right? So what we saw was that high tide plus 2.5 feet of flooding, and we remember we saw that in that picture. But had Hurricane Sandy's storm surge peaked at high tide instead of 5.5 hours later at near low tide, we would have experienced one of those 1 in 100 year or 100 chance flood events, which is today's high tide plus 5 feet. So that is something that people are starting to understand, that we missed flooding by just less than 6 hours. What is less well known is that since Hurricane Sandy, we've had 3 winter storms where we missed that same level of flooding by the same half tide cycle. So it was during Nemo and Saturn and Hercules that, again, just because the storms peaked at low tide, not high tide, we missed a major flooding event. The only time in recent history that we've had a major storm peak at a full moon high tide was during the blizzard of 78, and we did get that high tide plus 5-foot flood event. So the third reason that we have coastal flooding is the underlying sea level. Now, I'm sure you've all seen graphs like this. The actual numbers associated with those graphs differ based on, whether it's peer-reviewed data, worst-case scenario, most conservative data. But we use the U.S. National Climate Assessment as quite rigorous and not quite as conservative as the IPCC graph, because the IPCC uses only peer-reviewed data, so it's not quite as recent. So this we thought was very well founded. And the reasons for the differences in this graph, the lowest curve on the graph is basically that's the amount of sea level rise that is locked in given the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere right now. The highest curve on the graph is basically assuming that we do nothing to prevent greenhouse gas emissions from increasing, and also looking at probabilistic models as opposed to pure empirical data. Those predict higher sea level rises. So given that range of predictions, here's what we did for our planning. We looked at the range of most likely to possible sea levels for our planning. What that meant is that we are most likely to see a foot, but we could still see up to 2 feet of sea level rise in Boston mid-century. We are likely to see 3 feet or a meter. We could see up to 6 feet by the end of the century. And as data get better, these estimates keep going up, not down. These numbers, my belief is they don't include, this is really about thermal expansion. These numbers don't necessarily include glacial melt in Greenland and Antarctica. It also doesn't include local variability in Boston, and there's a couple reasons that Boston is experiencing faster relative sea level rise than other places. One is that our coastline is still sinking after the glaciers. It's hard to explain this verbally, but basically if you take a piece of paper and push down in the middle so it makes a U shape, the glacier was a mile deep in this area. It pushed down and actually pushed down the weight of the ground inland. It actually made the coastline go up during the Ice Age, and that coastline is still subsiding post-Ice Age 10,000 years later after the glaciers melted. The other reason that Boston is expected to see more sea level rise is that the Gulf Stream is expected to move east, and that will push more water towards the coastline, just as a storm surge would. So for those reasons, we are using the higher end of those ranges for our predictions to be more cautious. So this is what Boston, the flooding in Boston actually looked like during Hurricane Sandy, and at least 14 other times between January 2012 and April 2014. If you look at that yellow just around the edges, that's 0 to 2 feet of flooding, and that's what you saw in that picture of Long Wharf during Hurricane Sandy. Had those storm surges hit at high tide, this is the level of flooding we would have seen in Boston. So it's a pretty dramatic difference, and you can tell a couple things from this map. So this is today's high tide plus 5 feet. This is what we saw in the blizzard of '78. This is about 7% of Boston. I'm sorry, going back here, the yellow is 0 to 2 feet. The pink is 2 to 4 feet, and the 6 is above 4 feet in this map. So this is today's 100-year flood, essentially. This is today's flood zone. So if you need to get flood insurance, you're getting flood insurance in this area. But with 2 feet of sea level rise, this is going to be the level of flooding either during an annual storm or during one of those king tides. And then with 6 feet of sea level rise, this becomes approximately the daily high tide flood area by the turn of the century. So that's an extraordinary amount of salt water for the city to have to deal with twice a day. So this is, if you've been following the FEMA maps, these were the draft FEMA maps. The city of Boston is appealing them around the edges. Like there's about a 500-acre difference between what the city of Boston thinks this outline should be and what FEMA came up with. They used very different methods than our science team did, but came up with quite similar outcomes. So what floods at this level, what is currently in today's flood zone, essentially? So this is the innovation district. I've been trying not to call it the inundation district because this is one of the places that floods first, but billions of dollars of new development are occurring in this area right now. Plus New England's largest building, the Boston Exhibition Center is right up here. That's the largest building in New England. This is the Bayside Expo Center that UMass Boston just purchased for new buildings. If you use a Gillette razor, it came from Gillette World Shaving Headquarters in Fort Point Channel. This is the USS Constitution. Of course, it floats, but it's berthed at the Charlestown Navy Yard. And then if you've ever been to Faneuil Hall and Boston City Hall, there is an etching on the sidewalk between the two buildings that shows Boston's original shoreline. And at high tide plus 5 feet, you would see salt water back at that original shoreline. So this map is almost impossible to imagine happening today. This is high tide plus 7.5 feet. Theoretically, if you had a maximum storm surge during a wicked high tide, you would get this level of flooding, but the probability of this is vanishingly small. So this actually takes some future sea level rise for this to occur. But one thing that you can see from this map is that 30% of Boston is within 7.5 feet of today's high tide. And that's really our design challenge. I think that's the biggest takeaway from today's presentation is that when Boston, I'm going to show you a map of Boston in 1775, but all of these areas that are currently pink had been either open ocean or mudflats, and these are reclaimed lands from Boston Harbor. And when they were reclaimed or filled in to make new land, that was done with shovels and horses by people who were very clear that Boston Harbor was very protected from storm surges, and they never contemplated sea level rise. So they didn't fill these lands in very much. And that really is our design challenge. So we're not going to see these 10-foot storm surges, but once we start flooding, it's going to be chronic. So once we have a couple feet of sea level rise, this becomes our new floodplain, flood zone. This is the part of the Boston that's going to need flood insurance and flood protection. When we have 6 feet of sea level rise, this becomes an annual flood. It also becomes a flood at the wicked high tide, monthly wicked high tide. So what floods at this level? This starts to be Boston's commerce. So Logan Airport is 6 feet above high tide. Connolly Shipping Terminal, this is where all our containers come in and go all across New England. Our downtown wharves, this is the New England Aquarium. And our neighborhoods start to flood, East Boston, South Boston, Dorchester. So I'm about to overlay the 1775 map of Boston. Of course, it wasn't done with satellite imagery, so it's not exactly the same map, but you can get a sense of what the filled-in lands were. So I'm going to do that twice. So that's what Boston looks like in 1775. So compare that to the filled lands. So the takeaway from this is 250 years ago, this is what Boston looked like. Probably in 250 years from now, it'll look like that again. And our design challenge is, what do we do between now and then? So that's the next piece of this presentation. Do we have questions about the science underlying Boston sea level rise?
Hello, Julie. This is Anne. I did write down a couple of questions here, but I'm not sure if, let me just ask them right now. So one question towards the beginning was, what would the old oyster reefs in New York have done for storm surge? So that's not related to Boston, obviously. But one question regarding Boston was, is Boston considering future flooding or inundation levels to consider zoning, building, or infrastructure decisions?
Yes, and that's the next part of the presentation, so I'm happy to cover that.
Okay. So
let me answer that when I have the graphics to answer that. Yep. Good. Are there any other questions about sort of sea level rise before we shift to design and policy? We can always go back, but just so that's basically, here's our challenge, and now the next part of the presentation is what are we doing about it? So notice this. This is a picture of the aquarium T-stop during Nemo, and Nemo was a blizzard that came out that happened a couple weeks after Preparing for the Rising Tide came out. It was the first time the MBTA understood how close the T station was to high tide, and they put sandbags out. And that was the right response for today's high tide. Keep in mind what this looks like. So there's a very small foyer, and then within just a few feet you go right down an escalator, and we will be looking at aerial views of the same subway station later on. Okay, so one of the solutions to dealing with all this water, going back to what the Dutch are doing, they are really looking at resilience, which is basically bouncing back from flooding, having flooding occur but not do damage, versus resistance, which is when you're trying to keep all of the water out at once. So think of the difference between what you can do, a salt marsh, letting water in and out, versus an intensive care unit or a fine arts museum where you really can't allow flooding. So resilience really means elevating vulnerable resources above the floodplain, whether moving them inland or moving them upstairs. And then you pair with areas that might even be below grade that concentrates that water where you want it to be. The other thing about living with water is it favors flood control solutions that enhance livability, whether it's great open space, better transportation, energy efficiency, affordable housing. It's expensive, so you want to make every dollar count. So when we did our second report with Sasaki, we came up with a number of design principles based on about 100 living with water examples that we found worldwide. So one of the design principles is that you phase plans over time. You create a structure, whether it's a building, whether it's a seawall, whether it's a whatever, that is both adapted to today's conditions, but can be cheaply modified. It doesn't have to be completely rebuilt for tomorrow's conditions. So this is Spalding Rehab. It is Boston's most famous pre-adapted building. They actually had a credit crunch during the Great Recession. They didn't build this building as soon as they had intended to, so they decided to learn from what happened to hospitals in New Orleans during Katrina. So because of that, they put all their electrical equipment on the roof. There are no critical patient care operations on the first floor. It's basically conference room and a cafe. And then if the electrical grid goes down, they have a generator on the roof. If that fails, they can open the windows manually. So this is a building that is pre-adapted for almost 100 years of expected conditions. A second design principle is double duty solutions. This is one of my favorite urban designs. It was created by a Korean American woman who lives in Brookline. So the Cheongchang Channel in Seoul, South Korea, this had been the equivalent of Boston Southeast Expressway and our Big Dig. It was an elevated highway that was over a capped, smelly canal. There was a Korean student who told me that, this was the place that you went to get robbed. It was smelly and dark and scary and noisy, and was really urban blight. What the mayor of Korea, who then became the president of Korea, he did a design competition which McKeown Kim won. And she created this, which is now a go-to place in Seoul. It's a 7-mile long canal. It's an artificial canal in that they actually pump water through from their river to keep the water flowing during the dry season, and it is just the center of social life in Seoul, and this is what it looks like during their rainy season. So, of course, people don't go down there, but if you look around, their streets are fully drained, which had been a problem in the past. Their Han River, which is like our Charles River, they have well-managed green space on both sides during the dry season, and this is what it looks like during the rainy season. And you look on both sides of those flooded areas, and their highway still runs. So this is the idea of living with water. It's you're creating spaces for the water to go so that the rest of your community can still function. Another idea that we've talked about briefly is design for resilience. What the architects of this building said is fail quickly, fail cheaply. This is the Cuisinart Center for Culinary Excellence and the Johnson & Wales University campus. It is very vulnerable to 5-foot storm surges from Narragansett Bay. It's in Providence, Rhode Island. And what they did is they put all the expensive equipment on those top 3 floors. The bottom floor is just conference space and a loading dock. And even that space has stunt glass and stunt bricks. If it gets hit by a wall of water, that's breakaway glass and breakaway bricks. And so the force of the water goes right underneath the main part of the building, and the building stays true and the equipment's out of the way. One of my other favorite examples is the Gloucestershire Village Agents in in England. This is a rural community where 20% of the residents are senior citizens, many of them in dispersed communities, and some of them are homebound. The government paid their neighbors to look in on 20 or 30 neighbors for public health reasons, to make sure they were getting medications and good food and public health information. During the pilot project of this program, they had an historic rainfall where they got 3 months of rain in 3 days, and none of the elders died. That the village agents were right there for them, making sure they had fresh water and food and emergency information. And after that flood, the program was made permanent and expanded to isolated people of color. So this is the idea of using people-to-people social resilience to improve emergency response. Institutionalizing resilience can mean everything from aligning profitability with preparedness, changing tax codes, changing building codes. In this case, in the Netherlands, they saw, the Netherlands is not only right on the ocean, it has lots of miles of rivers. What they did in the Netherlands is they looked at the 30 places on the rivers where the water, there were pinch points and the water jumped the bank. And this is a 2,000-year-old community that, and you can see this is farmland, which often flooded. What they did is they bought out the farmers, they created a second channel, and this island became new social space, new retail space, and new residences in this old city. And you can see how that drew the local water level down so that the flooding occurred within the river channel, not into the community. Again, I think I'm just on the wrong presentation. So I think I'm just going to, I'm really sorry. I was on the right thing and somehow I jumped. But I want to say two more things before we end. One is that Boston Harbor Association, City of Boston, Boston Society of Architects, and the Boston Redevelopment Authority, we have partnered on an international design competition to bring living with water ideas to Boston. The first round ends January 29th. Happy to take any questions about that. We will be announcing the finalists February 24th, and then we will have a final award ceremony in June. And throughout that, we're having a series of public free lectures on sea level rise and resilient design. So we've actually, these materials have now been downloaded over 3,000 times, and we're looking forward to people teaming up and giving us fewer than 3,000 entries, but quite a few robust entries on redesigning a building, a neighborhood, and a piece of infrastructure. So I think what I want to end with is that basically if there's three things that you remember from this presentation, the first is that today's 100-year flood it could very well be mid-century's annual flood and 2100's high tide. Because of this, Boston will have to be different, but it doesn't have to be worse. And finally, preventing flood damage is going to be expensive. It's going to be the third wave of major public investment after the Boston Harbor cleanup and the Big Dig in Boston. So we need to make every dollar do double duty and solve other urban problems at the same time. Here's how to reach me. I'm happy to take questions now or later by email. It's probably the best way to get me. Thank you very much, and I do apologize that I had the wrong presentation up.
Thank you, Julie. I do have some questions, but I would like to encourage all remaining attendees to also ask questions via the Q&A window. So one question at the beginning was, what would the old oyster reefs in New York have done for storm surge?
Well, it's a good question. I would say I don't know New York enough But also, if you look at New York Harbor compared to Boston Harbor, I don't know how much of a difference the oyster reefs would have made. They would have slowed down the storm surge, certainly like Boston Harbor Islands do. But given the amount of water that Sandy generated, the fact that a bunch of that water was coming not through the harbor but down the East River, and the fact that those oyster beds were underwater, not above ground, it would have made some impact, but it wouldn't have prevented a lot of that flooding. It all helps, right? But it's probably not enough comparatively.
And then second question was, and that was, I think, with reference to a particular slide, but I don't recall which one that was. Does glacial rebound play a part in this? But that was also at the very beginning.
So glacial rebound, so we have seen about a foot of sea level rise in Boston since the end of the 1800s. Half of that has been glacial rebound, half of that has been sea level rise from climate change. And then another question that you may have now already answered with your second piece in the presentation, but I'm not sure if you would like to add anything. Is Boston considering future flooding or inundation levels to consider zoning, building, or infrastructure decisions? Yes, and that was a slide that I'd actually had in the presentation that I intended to give you, and I apologize that somehow I missed that when we were finally doing this presentation. The city of Boston actually has moved very quickly post Superstorm Sandy to get its act together. So Boston has completed a number of vulnerability assessments to sea level rise, not just coastal flooding, but also freshwater flooding and extreme temperatures. They looked at the municipal buildings. They looked at the Big Dig and our tunnels. I know the utilities are looking at the electrical grid. Boston Water and Sewer is looking at the water and sewer system. So the next step is to pull those vulnerability assessments together and say, where are we most vulnerable to a cascade of failures? Whether it is, if you lose the electrical grid, you can't recharge your cell phone and you can't pump gas, so you can have these cascading failures. So these vulnerability assessments are being done. Boston just released its updated climate action plan last week that focuses on preparedness. And the new mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, on the second anniversary of Sandy, announced that he's doing a multi-city mayor's summit of Boston plus the 13 communities that border Boston to say how are we going to have a regional approach to climate preparedness. So on the one hand, we've gotten a bit of a later start because people were really focused on climate mitigation, not preparedness. But I've never seen public policy go so quickly as I've seen this happen in Boston. I think, where there may be a shoe dropping is a question of, so who pays for this? That we have a federal government today that is not working well together, not looking at major new federal investments. That's a lot of the money that paid for the Big Dig. And how are we going to pay for something that, is it going to be up to Boston to protect Boston, or is there going to be a larger pool of public funding to protect our capital city? I just received another question. It says FEMA has recently, in the past 2 to 3 years, taken a much more proactive examination connecting various aspects of living in a greenhouse gas-constrained world to increasing coastal storms. Has Boston taken on new actions for emergency preparedness? Boston, so yes. FEMA, okay, so the FEMA maps we saw before, FEMA is banned by law from using prospective data. They can only look at what has happened in the past. That really limits FEMA from doing as much planning as I think it would like to be doing in terms of a changing environment around climate. Boston really is looking at, right now they call it natural hazard mitigation. So there's a lot of emergency response that happens in Boston. If folks followed what happened in the Boston Marathon bombing, it's very clear that Boston was prepared for a terrorist attack. That was an unbelievable, instant coordination among our public safety officials, and the perpetrators were caught quite quickly. That was not something they were planning on the spot. Boston already knows what to do during a blizzard. We've had plenty of blizzards. We know what to do. The issue is that we've not dealt with flooding over time or extreme precipitation. This is not something that we've had to deal with. We've also not had to deal with a changing external environment over the course of a single lifetime or a lifespan of a structure. So we have to wrap our heads around the idea of adaptation over time, not just adapting once and getting a plan in place, but saying, as our external environment changes, how does our planning have to change? And we're really just starting that. But Boston is mobilizing to do that. And there's a table talk exercise next month that looks at, if Boston were hit by a storm like Sandy, how would we respond? So folks are definitely doing that.
Okay, there's another question from Elizabeth, and I will unmute her in case she would like to ask you the question. But she wrote here in the chat window, in New York City, one of the challenges coming after Sandy is that the many small chemical and oil sites release pollution into the communities. Has this been studied here?
I want to show you something. If you look, so we are at the very beginnings of that. That is a problem. So just above this map, going up Chelsea Creek, a lot of our oil tanks are actually right on the coast, so that also in South Boston off the map to the south, we have major oil tanks right on the coastline. Those are some pretty obvious ones. We have many, many small sources of toxic pollution, whether it's people's oil tanks in their basements. If you saw pictures from Sandy, you saw a lot of antifreeze or whatever just from cars that were flooded. This is not something we've prepared for yet. And, I would not see this as a ding at the government. We're just brand new to thinking about. This is not a city that's flooded before a lot. And so we're just getting there. But yes, that is definitely one of the issues. Okay.
So one question here. One of the attendees that joined late is asking if you discussed SLR on housing. And then he has a follow-up question on that. If you have come up on any research regarding houseboats as part of an adaptation strategy?
I missed the noun. Houseboats, yes. So what's the effect on housing? So East Boston is one of our neighborhoods that are quite vulnerable. There's a lot of condominiums along these wharfs. Charlestown Navy Yard. This is mostly business. South Boston and down to Dorchester, there are a lot of residential neighborhoods that are within flood risk. So basically, any of those areas that were filled in over time in Boston, some of the places that flood, this is called the South Bay for a reason. This used to be the South Bay. This is all housing. This is the Back Bay. This is all housing. And this is actually not necessarily an environmental justice issue, because a lot of wealthy people like to live near water. So this spans the full range of incomes in Boston who lives near the water and is affected by flooding. So I think to the extent that we think about how do we deal with housing, I don't believe that we can manage this on a house-to-house basis. maybe short term, this is about keeping water out of one's basement, and you can do it relatively cheaply. But if we're trying to protect whole neighborhoods, we're going to have a whole neighborhood approach, whether that is seawalls, whether that is redesigning neighborhoods. When we're talking about this much water, there's going to be a pretty significant change in our infrastructure. One of the strategies people have talked about is putting a dam right here so that you can manage the water level in here and potentially protect this part of Boston Harbor, Boston's waterfront. It doesn't protect south of there, but that's potentially a partial solution is to say, okay, if we engineered water level upstream of Logan Airport and Castle Island, that could protect quite a bit of Boston's downtown, Chelsea, Everett, East Boston. So because we're basically 2 years into this conversation, we're really still grappling with what's at risk, and we're only starting to say what are the most socially appropriate and cost-effective solutions.
Hi, Julie. That seems like a great ending to the talk. I did have one more question. Will the designs from the competition be on display anywhere?
Yes, thank you for asking. So the design competition, the website for the design competition is bostonlivingwithwater.org. We, as of early February, we are going to have all of the entries up in a gallery, and we're actually going to have a people's vote. So we have professional judges who will be awarding the prizes, but we also want to see what